Frederick, Colorado is the kind of place where a five-bedroom house on a clean suburban street can look like a finished story. It can look settled. It can look safe.
In the summer of 2018, that appearance became the first layer of a case that moved from silence to national attention with frightening speed, and then kept going because the details were so ordinary at the start that many people could imagine themselves inside them. Christopher Lee Watts and Shanann Catherine Watts had built what looked, from the outside, like a typical American family life. They were originally from North Carolina. They met in 2010 and married in Mecklenburg County on November 3, 2012. They had two daughters, Bella Marie Watts and Celeste Catherine Watts. In the months before the disappearance, Shanann was pregnant again, 15 weeks along, expecting a boy they planned to name Nico. The family lived in Frederick, in a house on Saratoga Trail that they had purchased in 2013. They had also declared bankruptcy in 2015, a fact that matters here not because money alone explains anything, but because financial pressure is one of the quiet stresses that can sit in the background of a household without ever appearing on the front lawn. Christopher worked for Anadarko Petroleum. Shanann worked from home, selling a product called Thrive for a multi-level marketing company named Lavelle. On paper, it is a life many people recognize. A marriage, children, a mortgage, jobs, and the daily work of keeping everything moving. What makes this case different is not the setting. What makes it different is how abruptly the setting stopped making sense. On Monday, August 13th, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip to Arizona. She arrived at approximately 1:48 in the morning. She was driven home by her friend and colleague, Nicole Utoft Atkinson. Over that weekend, Christopher had been home with their daughters. The house was dark. The street was quiet. There was no announcement and no emergency call. There was only the normal idea that a mother has come back from travel and will sleep for a few hours before the day begins. Later that same day, the normal signals of Shanann's life failed to appear. She missed a scheduled obstetrics and gynecology appointment. She did not respond to text messages. She missed a business meeting. This was not the kind of absence that could be explained by a busy morning or a dead phone battery. For the people who knew her patterns, it was a break in routine sharp enough to be felt immediately. Nicole Atkinson became concerned because she could not reach her, and because the missed appointment added a sense of urgency that went beyond simple inconvenience. Around 12:10 in the afternoon, Atkinson went to the Watts residence. She rang the doorbell. She knocked. No one answered. The house did not open. The silence did not change. At that point, Atkinson did what friends do when they are no longer guessing and no longer waiting. She notified Christopher, who was at work, and she called the Frederick Police Department. The first official contact that day began as a welfare check, the kind of call that sits between the ordinary and the catastrophic, because officers arrive with no certainty, only a concern and a set of questions that must be answered in order. A Frederick police officer arrived to conduct the welfare check at about 1:40 in the afternoon. Christopher gave the officer permission to search the house. The search did not produce Shanann or the girls. It did produce the kind of quiet evidence that makes investigators slow down and start documenting every detail. The family dog was discovered unharmed inside the home. Shanann's purse was found, and inside it were her keys and her medicine. Her car was in the garage, and the girls' car seats were still inside it. Shanann's wedding ring was found on the bedside table. Later, her phone was located between the couch cushions in the family home. Each of these items matters because they are not dramatic, but they are personal and practical. Keys and medicine are the things people tend to keep close when they leave home. A phone is the object people reach for when plans change. A car seat suggests whether children traveled. A wedding ring left behind suggests something that does not fit a simple errand. None of it is a confession, None of it is a verdict, but together it is a picture of a life interrupted in a way that does not match a voluntary departure. By that afternoon, the case already had a problem that could not be explained away by a misunderstanding. A pregnant woman and 2 young children were gone, and the objects they would normally take with them were still inside the house. At that stage, law enforcement has to build a timeline quickly, because a missing person case depends on the first hours being used well. Investigators start with what can be verified. They note when a person was last seen. They collect statements that can be checked against data. They look for the simplest explanation first, and then rule it out when the facts refuse to cooperate. In this case, there was no sign of Shanann leaving with her daughters in a normal way, and there was no contact that suggested she was safe. The next day, the scope of the investigation expanded. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation joined the case. That change alone signals how quickly the situation was being treated as serious. When multiple agencies join, it usually means the available information is not moving the case toward a safe resolution, and the risks are being recalculated upward. Christopher initially told police that he had no idea where his family might be. He said he had not seen Shanann since 5:15 in the morning when he left for work. This detail is important because a time like that becomes a hinge point. It is the kind of claim investigators can test. A statement about the last time someone was seen is not just conversation. It becomes the spine of a timeline, and timelines either hold or collapse. While investigators worked behind the scenes, Christopher went in front of cameras. He gave interviews outside the house to Denver stations KMGH-TV and KUSA-TV. He pleaded for the return of his wife and daughters. It was a scene that many viewers would later recognize immediately because it's placed the family home at the center of the story, and it framed the case as a search for missing loved ones. During the interview, investigators with search dogs could be heard on the property. That detail captures the tension of those days. The public saw a husband speaking into microphones, asking for his family to come home, while just beyond the camera frame, search teams moved through the reality of the situation, treating the house and the yard as places where answers might be hiding. By then, the story had 2 tracks moving at the same time. One was public, built from brief statements, familiar family photos, and the ordinary language of hope. The other was investigative, built from objects in a house, a tight timeline, and the uncomfortable fact that the last person known to have been with Shanann and the children was also the person standing in front of the cameras. In cases like this, investigators cannot rely on emotion. They rely on consistency. They look at whether the story changes. They look at whether small details shift when questions are asked again. They look at whether someone's account fits the physical facts, including what is inside the house and what is missing from it. The early evidence at Saratoga Trail did not behave like a planned trip, a sudden hospital visit, or an impulsive decision to disappear. It behaved like absence without preparation. In the background of those first days, the life of the family remained visible in a way that was uniquely modern. Shanann had been active online. Friends knew her routines. Missed appointments stood out. Missed messages stood out. Concern spread quickly because the silence was not private. It was noticeable. That is why Atkinson's actions mattered so much. She did not wait for the story to correct itself. She treated the silence as urgent, and her decision forced the first welfare check to happen while the day was still unfolding. The difference between a welfare check on the first afternoon and a report made days later can be the difference between a mystery and a case that is already narrowing toward one inevitable direction. By the time the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation joined, the investigation was no longer just about finding a location. It was about testing the only narrative available and finding out whether it could survive contact with fact. Christopher's statement about leaving for work at 5:15 in the morning set a boundary line in the case. Everything that happened after that time needed an explanation. Everything that could be discovered before that time needed to be reconciled with the objects left in the house, including the purse, the phone, the car seats, and the ring. And because he had spoken publicly, his words were now part of the record in the minds of the community. The pressure on investigators was not only to find the missing family, but also to move with enough care that every step could be defended later, when the case would inevitably be judged, not just in a courtroom, but across the entire country. This is the stage of the story where an investigation becomes more than a search. It becomes a process of elimination. It becomes a controlled effort to reduce a wide field of possibilities to a small set of facts that point in one direction. In the Watts case, that narrowing began almost immediately because the people closest to Shanann could tell something was wrong, and because the house itself held too many of her essential things. When the simplest explanations do not fit, investigators begin preparing for the kind of interview where statements are tested, repeated, and compared against what can be verified. The case was moving toward that moment. The missing family story was already under the weight of its own inconsistencies, and the next step would be to bring Christopher Foley into an investigative setting where the questions do not stop at the front door and do not end when the cameras turn off. By the end of the first 48 hours, the case in Frederick had a shape that investigators recognize immediately. A home that still held a purse, keys, medicine, a phone, and car seats is not the home of someone who calmly left with a plan. A husband who says he has no idea where his family went becomes the center of the timeline, not because of gossip, but because timelines are built around last known contact. In this case, the last known contact was the person who lived in the same house. On Tuesday, August 14th, federal and state investigators joined the search. That change matters because it marks a shift from a local welfare check to a coordinated missing persons investigation with serious risk assumptions. The story on the street was still framed as a disappearance. The story inside the investigation was already narrowing because the quiet evidence inside the house did not match the idea of a voluntary departure. The most dangerous thing about a case like this is how quickly it becomes familiar. People begin to fill gaps with what they have seen in other stories. They start to imagine a sudden argument, a secret trip, a hidden crisis, or a stranger. Investigators cannot do that. They have to map facts to time and place, and they have to build pressure where the story is weak. That pressure does not begin with shouting. It begins with repetition. It begins with asking the same questions in different ways, and then comparing the answers to what can be verified. Christopher Watts had already spoken publicly, asking for his family to come home. He had done it outside the same house that officers had searched. Search dogs could be heard on the property while cameras recorded his plea. For many viewers, that moment later became a symbol of the case, because it captured two realities at once. One reality was the performance of hope. The other reality was the movement of law enforcement through a scene that no longer felt like a simple missing persons call. When investigators look at a spouse early in an investigation, they are not making an accusation. They are doing math. The spouse is usually the person who can account for the last hours. The spouse is usually the person with the most access. The spouse is usually the person whose story will either open the search outward or collapse it inward. That is why interviews matter so much, and why the tone can shift from cooperative to controlled without any dramatic announcement. In a controlled interview, small details become weight. If someone says their wife left the home with the children, then the investigation must find evidence of that. If someone says a woman left with no purse, no keys, no medicine, and no phone, then the investigation must determine whether that is plausible. If a person says they do not know where their family is, the investigation has to ask what they did, what they saw, what they touched, and what they avoided. The objective is not a confession. The objective is clarity, and clarity often arrives when a story cannot hold up under simple, persistent questions. On Wednesday, August 15th, investigators administered a polygraph examination to Christopher Watts. A polygraph is not magic, and it does not replace evidence, but it is often used as an investigative tool because it changes the emotional balance in the room. It forces a person to commit to a narrative, and it creates a moment where denial becomes harder to sustain. In this case, Watts failed the polygraph. The investigation did not end there. It accelerated. After the polygraph, the story shifted again, and it shifted in the way investigators dread and expect at the same time. Christopher Watts confessed first to his father, Ronnie Watts, and then to authorities that he had killed Shanann. But he did not tell the truth of what happened to everyone in the house. He gave a version that tried to move the most shocking blame away from himself. He falsely claimed that he killed Shanann only after Shanann had smothered their daughters. That claim mattered for two reasons. It attempted to create a motive that sounded emotional and sudden, rather than calculated. And it attempted to draw a line between the death of the children and the death of their mother, as if one act forced the other. Investigators did not accept it as a clean explanation. They treated it as what it often is in cases like this, a partial admission designed to control the damage. In that initial confession narrative, Watts claimed he had discovered Bella already dead, and that he found Shanann in the process of strangling Celeste. He claimed that, in a fit of rage, he strangled Shanann. He also described what he did next, because at some point, a confession without locations is just a story, and investigators need recoveries. Watts worked for Anadarko, and he told investigators he disposed of the bodies at an Anadarko oil field where he worked. That detail turned the case from a search across neighborhoods into a search for specific ground. It connected the disappearance to his workplace, and it connected the timeline to a remote site that most people would never visit. The suburban street was still the public stage, but the real geography of the crime was now being described somewhere far from the clean sidewalks and quiet driveways. Watts was arrested on August 15th. That arrest was not only about what he said. It was about the fact that his account, even in its self-serving form, placed him at the center of 3 deaths and placed the bodies at a location connected to him. Investigators did what they always do when a suspect begins giving locations. They asked him to show them. Watts marked the locations of the bodies on a photograph of the oil field. This is one of the most important transitions in any case. The moment when words have to become directions, and directions have to become something real. On August 16th, investigators arrived at the oil field late at night at about 11 o'clock. They found what the public feared but did not yet know. They found Shanann buried in a shallow grave. They found Bella and Celeste in crude oil storage tanks. The missing persons case was over. The homicide investigation was now the only story that mattered, because there was no longer any question about whether the family would be found alive. Even here, the case carried a kind of nightmare logic that was hard for people to process. The bodies of the children had been placed through small openings at the tops of different tanks. It was a method of concealment that was also a statement about distance. about trying to hide the victims in a place most people would never search without a direct tip. The location itself became part of why the case remained in the public mind. A suburban home had led to an industrial landscape, and the contrast made the outcome feel even more unreal. Once the recoveries were made, the case moved into the legal system with speed. When a person confesses and bodies are recovered, the investigation becomes about documentation and charges. It becomes about building a case file that can survive every challenge, every claim of misunderstanding, and every attempt to change the story later. On August 21st, Watts was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The charges included additional counts per child that reflected the fact that the victims were under 12 and that the defendant was in a position of trust. He was also charged with unlawful termination of a pregnancy and with 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. By the day of his arrest, Anadarko had fired him. At his first court appearance, he was denied bail. In cases that become national stories, the public often expects one defining piece of video or audio that explains everything. In reality, investigations are built from many small confirmations. But in this case, there was later a piece of surveillance that hit the public like a hammer, because it pulled the case back to the driveway, back to the house, back to the place where Christopher had stood, and asked for his family to return. On November 29th, Colorado authorities released surveillance footage captured in the early morning hours of August 13th on a neighbor's security camera. The footage showed Watts, hours after he killed his wife and daughters, loading a gas can into the bed of his pickup truck and then backing the vehicle into his garage. Police believed he was transporting the bodies of his family to the remote oil works site where they were later discovered. The release mattered because it stripped away the last illusion that Shanann could have walked out of the home with her daughters later that morning. It reinforced what investigators had already concluded. She returned home, and she never left again with her children, despite what he had claimed in the early phase of the investigation. This is also where the case began to be discussed in broader terms. The media connected it to the concept of family annihilation, the kind of crime that is rare and difficult to predict because it violates the basic assumption that the home is the safest place for children. Former law enforcement voices pointed out that many family annihilators die by suicide after the murders, which is one reason these cases can unfold differently. In this case, Christopher Watts did not disappear. He did not flee. He stood in front of cameras. He returned phone calls. He participated in the first day of the search inside his own house. And then, under pressure, he admitted to killing Shanann while trying to shift the story of the children onto her. By the time the charges were filed, the public wanted a single motive that could make the story feel contained. People look for an explanation because an explanation feels like protection. If the motive is clear, then the case can be placed behind glass, labeled as an exception. But real cases do not cooperate with that need. The legal record focuses on what can be proved. The investigation focuses on what happened, when it happened, and how it was concealed. Motive becomes a secondary question until the timeline is locked down. In the Watts case, the timeline locked quickly, and then it kept tightening as more information became public. A friend reported the disappearance within hours. A welfare check happened that afternoon. The purse, keys, medicine, phone, car seats, and ring stayed behind. The FBI and state investigators joined on the second day. A public plea happened while search dogs worked the property. A polygraph happened on the third day. The confession followed. The arrest followed. Then the recoveries happened, and the entire country learned what those missing faces on the news had been missing from. From this point forward, the story changes again. It is no longer a question of where they are. It becomes a question of how a man could live inside a normal-looking life and then destroy it in a way that seemed to erase the family from a Monday morning routine. It becomes a question of what was happening inside that marriage in the weeks leading up to August 13th, and how the public image of a family can coexist with pressures the outside world rarely sees. And it becomes a question of what the justice system does with a case that is already solved in the sense of identity, but still unresolved in the sense of meaning. Because even after an arrest, even after bodies are found, the hardest part of a story like this is that people keep asking the same question, not for entertainment, but because they cannot accept how simple the beginning was. A friend knocked on a door, a house stayed silent, and a missing persons call became one of the most infamous murder cases of its decade. Once the bodies were recovered, the case stopped being a search and became a legal machine that had to document every step and lock every fact into the record. The public often imagines that a confession ends the story. In reality, a confession starts a different phase. It turns investigators into archivists. It turns detectives into witnesses. It turns a tragedy into files, counts, hearings, and sentences that have to be precise enough to withstand years of scrutiny. Within days of the arrest, the charge structure made the stakes clear. Prosecutors charged Christopher Watts with first-degree murder counts tied to each death. The filing included an additional count for each child based on the children being under 12 and Watts being in a position of trust. There was also a charge for unlawful termination of a pregnancy, reflecting that Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant, and there were multiple counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The details of those counts mattered because the legal system does not punish a story. It punishes specific acts, defined by statute, each one separated and labeled, so there is no ambiguity about what is being held accountable. At his first court appearance, he was denied bail. That decision reflected both the severity of the charges and the simple reality that there was no safe way to treat the case like a standard criminal matter. Public interest was massive. The community had already watched the early days unfold on local news. People had seen the house. They had seen the driveway. They had seen the husband pleading on camera. Now the case was moving into the part that the public usually does not see, where prosecutors and defense attorneys negotiate, not about what happened in the broad sense, but about how the case will be resolved and what punishment will be imposed. A key point in the timeline came in late November, when authorities released surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera. The footage showed Watts in the early morning hours of the day of the murders, loading a gas can into his pickup truck and then backing the truck into the garage. Investigators believed this was part of transporting his family's bodies to the remote oil site where they were later found. For many people, the footage functioned like a harsh correction because it narrowed the last remaining uncertainty about whether Shanann had ever left the home that morning with the children, as Watts had initially claimed. The driveway became a record. The garage became a boundary. The story could no longer float. As the legal process moved forward, the prosecution faced a choice that always sits over high-profile murder cases in death penalty states. At the time, Colorado still had the death penalty available in law, even though it would later be abolished. The Weld County District Attorney did not pursue it in this case, and that decision was made at the request of Shanann's family. They did not wish for any further deaths, and they supported the plea agreement that removed the death penalty from consideration. That single decision reshaped everything that came next, because it shifted the case away from a long death penalty trial and toward a resolution that could be finalized in months instead of years. On November 6, 2018, Christopher Watts pleaded guilty to the murders and related counts as part of the plea deal. A guilty plea is not just a statement of guilt. It is an exchange. It closes off certain avenues of litigation and appeal and, in return, it provides finality.
For a family, finality can be the only thing left that explains why they would accept anything short of the maximum available punishment. In this case, the family's position was clear. They wanted the case to end without additional loss of life, and they wanted it to end with certainty.
Less than 2 weeks later, on November 19th, he was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. The structure of the sentence matters because it shows how the court treated the murders as separate crimes, rather than a single event. He received 5 life sentences in total, with 3 ordered to be served consecutively and 2 concurrently. He also received additional prison time for the unlawful termination of the pregnancy and for the counts of tampering with a deceased body. In plain terms, the court locked the case into an outcome where release was not a realistic future. Even after sentencing, the case still had practical issues that the public rarely considers. A high-profile defendant can become a safety problem inside a prison system. There are threats from other inmates. There are threats from the outside. There are security costs that multiply. On December 3rd, 2018, Watts was moved to an out-of-state location due to security concerns. 2 days later, on December 5th, he arrived at Dodge Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in Waupun, Wisconsin, where he would continue serving his life sentences. If the case had ended there, it would still have been infamous. But it did not end there, because the public response and the ongoing interviews created a second life for the story. One built from recorded material, police footage, and later admissions that changed how people understood the sequence of events. One reason the Watts case stayed in the national conversation is that it was documented in fragments from the beginning. There were body cameras at the house. There were recorded interviews inside police rooms. There were security cameras in the neighborhood. There were text messages and social media posts that provided a visible timeline of ordinary life right up to the moment the family disappeared. As those pieces became public, they gave viewers the feeling of standing beside investigators as the story moved from missing persons to homicide. As media accounts expanded, another fact remained central. Watts initially confessed to killing Shanann, but he falsely claimed that she had smothered the children first, and that he killed her in response. The structure of that claim was important. It attempted to turn him into a person reacting to tragedy rather than initiating it. It attempted to split the crime into parts, creating a sequence that sounded less deliberate and more like a sudden loss of control. But the broader record did not allow the case to stay in that version. Months later, Watts admitted that he had also murdered his children. That admission changed the moral clarity of the case from horrifying to absolute, because it removed the final attempt to assign responsibility elsewhere. It also reinforced why investigators do not treat first confessions as complete truth. Confessions can be strategies. They can be bargaining chips. They can be stories designed to reduce blame. Investigators and prosecutors treat them as starting points that must be tested against everything else. The case was also discussed publicly through the lens of familicide, sometimes called family annihilation, a rare pattern where one person kills members of their own family. Analysts and former investigators pointed out that many family annihilators take their own lives after the murders, which is one reason these crimes can end without a trial. In this case, that did not happen. Watts remained in place. He spoke to police. He spoke to cameras. He participated in interviews. And then, after failing a polygraph, he shifted into confession. That pattern became part of why the public fixated on the story. People asked how someone could stand outside a home and plead for the return of his family while knowing the outcome. They replayed his words. They searched for signs that never needed to be obvious in order to be real. The case became a kind of cautionary narrative about appearances, about how a family can look stable from the outside while private pressures build behind closed doors. By the time Watts was transferred to Wisconsin, the legal question was settled, but the human questions were not. People wanted to understand why. The Wikipedia record summarizes the motive in 2 words that often travel together in familicide cases: resentment and infidelity. Those words do not explain the violence on their own, but they describe the pressure points that prosecutors and investigators saw in the background. They also explain why the story could not be contained to the driveway or the oil field. The story had to reach back into the marriage, into the weeks leading up to August 13th, into what was said and what was hidden, and into why a man would decide that the only way to move forward was to erase the family he already had. That is where the case becomes more than a timeline. It becomes a study in how quickly a life can change when a person begins treating other human beings as obstacles rather than as people. It becomes a study in how an ordinary Monday can turn into a national case file. And it becomes a study in how the justice system handles a crime that is both deeply personal and broadly public at the same time. From here, the story moves into what the records and later interviews reveal about the days leading up to the murders, the behavioral changes noticed by people around him, and the way investigators and the media reconstructed motive from the fragments left behind. The outcome in court was final. The question of what was happening inside that house and inside that marriage remained the part that people could not stop trying to understand. After the arrest and the recovery of the bodies, the Watts case entered a phase that feels quiet on the surface, but is relentless underneath. It is the phase where investigators stop asking where the missing people are and start documenting how a crime happened, why it happened, and what can be proven beyond dispute. It is also the phase where the public tries to turn shock into understanding, because without understanding, the story stays too close to home. In the official record, the motive is summarized in 2 words that appear again and again in familicide cases: resentment and infidelity. Those words are not a complete explanation, but they are a map of pressure. Resentment suggests a long build of anger that was not resolved in a healthy way. Infidelity suggests a double life, where a person is moving between 2 worlds, saying different things to different people, and making decisions that cannot survive exposure. When those pressures exist inside a family home, the danger is not always obvious, because the home can still look normal from the sidewalk. The media connected the case to the concept of family annihilation, also called familicide, a category that is rare but distinct. In these crimes, one person destroys their own family, often as a form of control, escape, or punishment. Analysts have noted that many family annihilation cases happen in August, before school starts, when routine breaks and detection can be delayed. A former Federal Bureau of Investigation profiler described these cases as rare partly because many perpetrators die by suicide after the murders. In this case, that did not happen. Christopher Watts remained present, stayed in the home environment, engaged with police, and went on television. He later said he had contemplated suicide out of guilt, but contemplation is not action, and the legal system can only respond to what was done, not what was considered. As the investigation hardened, the nature of his first confession became a central issue. He admitted to killing Shanann, but tried to shift the deaths of the children onto her, claiming she had smothered them first and that he killed her in reaction. That kind of claim is familiar to investigators because it attempts to reframe the perpetrator as a person responding to a sudden crisis rather than initiating it. It also attempts to create a moral fog around the children's deaths by placing responsibility on the one person who cannot contradict a story. Over time, the record did not remain in that version. Months later, Watts admitted that he had murdered his children as well. That admission mattered because it removed the last remaining structure of his early narrative. It forced the case into its simplest truth, that he did not just kill his wife, but also killed the two children who depended on him for safety. A striking element in how the story continued to unfold was the way different accounts entered the public view after the core facts were already established. On a December 2018 episode of the talk show Dr. Phil, Watts' lawyer described the sequence that began with an argument about divorce. In that version, during the murder, Bella walked into the room. Watts told her that Shanann was sick. He then loaded Shanann's body and the girls into his work truck without their car seats. He later smothered the girls, one after the other. That account was presented publicly as an explanation of sequence and motive, and it reinforced the idea that the crime was not an instant act of rage that ended in one moment. It was a chain of decisions made in stages. At the same time, the case became a landmark example of how modern investigations and modern families can leave a trail of recorded life. Local agencies, national agencies, and news outlets had access to material that earlier decades rarely produced. There was police body camera footage from the welfare check at the home. There were recorded interview rooms. There was neighborhood security footage. There were public pleas outside the house that were broadcast live. There were also the ordinary digital traces of family life, including videos, messages, and posts that preserved the tone of everyday routines before they disappeared. In December 2018, the ABC News program $20 featured interviews with Shanann's parents for the first time since the murders. That mattered because it moved the story beyond the perpetrator and back toward the victims, reminding audiences that a crime like this is not only a legal file, but a permanent absence in a family that has to keep living. That same month, the network HLN aired a special report titled Family Massacre, Chris Watts Exposed. The report included footage from police body cameras and security cameras in the interview room, material that gave viewers a direct look at how investigators questioned Watts and how he behaved in the early hours of the case. Also in this period, a recorded interview released by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation included statements from Watts' girlfriend describing behavioral changes in the days before the murders. The word girlfriend matters here because it connects directly to the motive of infidelity. The interview did not change the legal outcome, but it added context to the private world Watts was living in while presenting a family man image publicly. Behavioral changes in the days before a homicide can be the visible edge of a hidden plan. They can also be the cracks that appear when a person is trying to hold two incompatible lives at the same time. The case continued to generate analysis because it created a disturbing contradiction that many people could not resolve. How could someone speak calmly to police in his own home while knowing that his family was already gone? How could someone plead in front of cameras while investigators searched the property behind him? How could a person maintain the surface of normality long enough to pass through the first stages of an investigation, only to collapse under sustained questioning and fail a polygraph? In public discussions, Experts and commentators dissected those contradictions. On GBA show, Phil McGraw spoke with a panel that included former prosecutor and journalist Nancy Grace, former Federal Bureau of Investigation profiler Candace DeLong, law enforcement consultant Steve Cardian, and body language expert Susan Constantine. The discussion focused on motivation, secret life, and profiling, trying to explain how a person who looked ordinary could move toward a crime this extreme. In January 2019, the Dr. Oz Show featured commentary, including an interview with the neighbor who helped build the case against Watts. Those appearances mattered because they turned a criminal case into a cultural case study, and they extended the story beyond the courtroom. As time passed, new details continued to emerge through media reports, and some of the most disturbing additions came years after the sentencing. In June 2021, Inside Edition reported further confessions from Watts in letters to a pen pal. In those letters, he said he had planned the murders for several weeks. He said that OxyContin found in Shanann's system had been given to her by him, and he described doing it in hopes of ending the pregnancy because he believed that would make it easier for him to be with his girlfriend. He also wrote that he had attempted to smother his children in their beds at home, but had been unsuccessful. Those statements, reported as his own words, painted a picture that was colder and more deliberate than the story he first tried to tell. And they reinforced why investigators treat early accounts with caution. A person may admit the act while still trying to control the narrative of intention. The public response to revelations like that is predictable and complicated. People feel the need to rank horror, to decide whether planning is worse than rage, whether betrayal is worse than violence, whether deception is worse than cruelty. The truth is that in a case like this, each layer amplifies the others. Planning does not remove rage, and rage does not remove planning. Deception is not separate from the violence. It is part of how the violence is carried out and how the perpetrator tries to survive it afterward. The story also continued through adaptations, which became a second battlefield, not over facts, but over ownership and respect. In December 2019, Oxygen released a 1-hour documentary about the case as the first episode of a series called Criminal Confessions. In January 2020, Lifetime released a film titled Chris Watts, Confessions of a Killer as part of its Ripped from the Headlines lineup. Shanann's family publicly denounced the film, saying they were not consulted and were not aware of the production until it was already underway. They also said they were not making any money from it and feared it would increase online harassment they had already experienced. Those statements matter because they expose a hard truth about high-profile cases. Long after the legal system closes, the victims' families still live inside the story, while the world continues to consume it as content. On September 30th, 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door. The documentary was built from archival footage including home videos, social media posts, text messages, and law enforcement recordings. The approach made viewers feel like they were watching the case unfold in real time, with the family's own recorded life becoming part of the narrative. That method is one reason the Watts case remains so widely known. It did not require reenactment to feel real, because so much of the real material already existed. When people look back at the case now, the timeline is clear and the legal outcome is final. He pleaded guilty on November 6, 2018. He was sentenced on November 19th to multiple life sentences without parole. He was moved out of state for security reasons in early December and transferred to a maximum security prison in Waupun, Wisconsin. Those facts do not change. What changes over time is how the public understands the path that led there. The Watts case stays in the public mind because it forces an uncomfortable recognition. A family can look normal right up until the moment it is destroyed. A person can appear cooperative right up until the moment the story collapses. A home can look peaceful even when it is holding the evidence of what happened inside it. And when the motive is resentment and infidelity, the warning signs can be emotional rather than physical, hidden in private conversations, hidden in shifts of attention, hidden in the sudden coldness that a spouse notices but cannot prove. This part of the story is not about the search or the arrest. It is about the aftermath, the way a case becomes a permanent artifact, replayed through footage, analyzed by experts, and reinterpreted by the public. It is about how the legal system delivered finality, while the cultural system kept producing new versions, new commentaries, and new pieces of context. And it is about how the last word, even years later, sometimes comes from the perpetrator himself, in letters that reveal planning, intent, and a willingness to treat his own family as obstacles to a life he wanted to start over. The reason that matters is simple. If the crime is framed only as a sudden explosion, people can dismiss it as an exception. If it is framed as a sequence of choices made over weeks, people have to confront something more terrifying. They have to confront the idea that a person can decide, plan, and execute while still living in the same house, still driving to work, still speaking to neighbors, and still smiling for a camera, until the day the family disappears and the entire world begins asking questions that can never fully be answered. After the courtroom doors closed and the sentence was set, the Watts case did not fade the way many cases do. It kept returning in waves, not because the legal outcome was uncertain, but because new pieces of the record kept reaching the public, each one changing how the story felt in hindsight. The murders were fixed in time. The understanding of them kept moving. In late November of 2018, Colorado authorities released neighborhood surveillance footage from the morning of August 13th. It showed Christopher Watts near his pickup truck, loading a gas can into the bed and backing the vehicle into the garage. Police believed he was transporting the bodies to the remote oil site where they were later discovered. When that footage became public, it did something that words could not do. It turned the driveway into a timeline. It turned a normal morning motion into a visible boundary line. It reinforced that Shanann returned home after the Arizona trip and never left again with the girls, despite what Watts had initially claimed. In December of 2018, the case moved deeper into the public consciousness through televised coverage that shifted attention back toward the victims and toward the investigative process. On an episode of the ABC News series 2020, Shanann's parents were interviewed for the first time since the murders. Their presence mattered because it removed the story from speculation and placed it inside grief. It reminded viewers that behind every timeline detail was a family that would carry the consequences permanently. That same month, LN aired a special report titled Family Massacre, Chris Watts Exposed. The report included footage from police body cameras and security cameras in the police station interview room. Those recordings mattered because they showed the investigation as it unfolded, rather than as it was summarized later. They captured how quickly a welfare check can shift into a focused inquiry when the facts in the house do not fit the story being told. They captured the kind of calm, repetitive questioning that investigators use to test a narrative. They also captured how a suspect behaves when the room is quiet and the stakes are rising. A recorded interview released by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation added another layer. In that interview, Watts' girlfriend described behavioral changes in the days before the murders. The value of that information was not in drama. It was in context. If the official motive was resentment and infidelity, then the relationship outside the marriage becomes part of the background pressure. It becomes the the second life running parallel to the first. It becomes a reason a person might believe they can start over, even when starting over would require the destruction of what already exists. As the case was discussed more widely, it was repeatedly connected to the concept of family annihilation, also called familicide. That label is not a moral explanation. It is a classification. It describes a pattern where one person kills members of their own family, often inside a home that looks stable from the outside. Many people struggle with that pattern because it attacks an assumption most Americans live by, that children are safest at home, and that a spouse is the last person a family should fear. Commentators and former investigators pointed out that many family annihilators die by suicide after the murders. Former FBI profiler Candace DeLong said these cases are rare partly because of that outcome. Watts claimed he contemplated suicide out of guilt, but the case did not end that way. It ended with him staying in place long enough to plead on camera, to speak to police, and to go through a polygraph that he failed. That failure and the confession that followed were already known to the public by then. But the case continued to generate discussion because the first confession was not a full truth. Watts admitted he killed Shanann, but he falsely claimed he did so because Shanann had smothered the girls. That claim mattered for what it tried to accomplish. It attempted to shift the children's deaths onto the victim. It attempted to frame the murder of Shanann as reaction rather than initiation. It attempted to change how the public would interpret his responsibility. Months later, he also admitted to murdering his children. That admission removed the last structure of his early narrative, and it reinforced a hard rule in homicide work. Early confessions are often shaped by self-interest. They may contain true locations and false motives. They may contain true acts and false sequences. Investigators treat them as evidence to be tested, not as a story to be accepted. The Watts case also became a lesson in how modern life produces records that cannot be erased. The investigation was not built only from witnesses and intuition. It was built from the objects found in the home, the missing items that were not missing, the car seat still in the garage, and the phone hidden in a place that suggested it was not simply misplaced. It was built from the welfare check that happened quickly because a friend recognized that Shanann's silence did not match her habits. It was built from recorded interviews, surveillance video, and the kind of public pleading that becomes impossible to separate from later guilt. This is why the case remains so visible. It did not require reenactment to feel real. It had the raw material of reality already on tape. In December of 2018, the talk show Dr. Phil devoted an episode to the case, with Phil McGraw speaking with analysts including Nancy Grace, Candace DeLong, Steve Cardian, and body language expert Susan Constantine. They analyzed motive, secret life, and profiling. These discussions mattered because they attempted to answer the question the public kept asking: how a person could maintain the appearance of normal life while moving toward an act that would destroy it. In January of 2019, the case reached another daytime audience through The Dr. Oz Show, which featured coverage related to the investigation. These segments extended the cultural life of the story. They also contributed to a pattern that often follows cases like this, where the legal system provides finality but the media environment keeps reopening the narrative. Searching for meaning the courtroom does not provide. Then the story kept evolving, not through court filings, but through later claims attributed to Watts himself. In June of 2021, Inside Edition reported further confessions from Watts to a pen pal, described as multiple letters. In those letters, He wrote that he planned the murders for several weeks. He wrote that OxyContin found in Shanann's system had been given to her by him, with the intent of ending her pregnancy because he believed that would make it easier for him to be with his girlfriend. He also wrote that he attempted to smother his children in their beds at home but was unsuccessful. Those statements did not change the verdict. He had already pleaded guilty. They did not change the sentence. He was already serving life without parole. What they changed was the texture of the case in the public mind. Planning suggests deliberation rather than a single moment of rage. Drugging suggests deception layered on deception, an attempt to control outcomes without confrontation. An attempted smothering that failed suggests a timeline with more than one threshold, more than one moment where a person could have stopped and did not. When a case contains revelations like that, the public response tends to split into two directions. One direction is disbelief, because people want to believe there is a clear warning sign that separates ordinary families from catastrophe. The other direction is fixation, because the more ordinary the setting, the more people try to locate the point where it shifted into danger. In the Watts case, the setting remained suburban and familiar. The home remained a normal American home. The family photographs remained the kind of photographs anyone might have. The shock comes from the distance between those images and the outcome. The case also continued through adaptations, which introduced a different kind of conflict, not about guilt, but about ownership and exposure. In December of 2019, Oxygen released a 1-hour documentary about the case as the first episode of a season of Criminal Confessions. In January of 2020, Lifetime released a film titled Chris Watts, Confessions of a Killer as part of its Ripped from the Headlines feature series. Shanann's family spoke out against the film, stating they had not been consulted and were not aware it was being made until it was already in production. For a grieving family, that kind of adaptation can feel like an intrusion. The legal system has rules for evidence and punishment. Entertainment has different incentives. The boundary between public record and private pain is not always protected, especially when a case has become famous. In September of 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door. The documentary relied heavily on archival material, including home videos, social media, text messages, news footage, and law enforcement recordings. The method made the story feel immediate and intimate because the family's own recorded life became part of the narrative. It brought viewers close to the ordinary routines that existed right up to the moment those routines vanished. This is one of the reasons the Watts case remains a defining true crime story of its era. It sits at the intersection of family life, digital documentation, and investigative recording. It shows how quickly a missing persons call can become a homicide investigation when the house itself holds the wrong kind of silence. It shows how a public plea can become a piece of evidence in the court of public opinion, replayed not because it proves guilt by itself, but because it becomes unbearable in hindsight. It also shows how motive can be described in simple words, while the human reality remains complex. Resentment and infidelity are the motive as summarized in the record, but those words do not carry the full weight of what happened. They do not explain why a person would choose annihilation over separation. They do not explain how a father could treat his own children as obstacles. They do not explain why a man would believe he could remove his family from his life and still keep the appearance of normal for even one more day. The legal outcome delivered a firm answer to society's question of accountability. Watts pleaded guilty on November 6, 2018. He was sentenced on November 19th to life without parole, with multiple life sentences and additional years. He was moved out of state for security concerns in early December
and transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. But the story did not stop because the cultural question was different. The cultural question was about recognition. It was about whether there were signs that could have been seen. It was about whether social media, financial pressure, and private relationships can combine into a situation where someone begins to imagine that destruction is a solution. It was about how a person can split into roles: husband, father, employee, boyfriend, and then choose the one role that offers the illusion of escape. In the years that followed, each new release of footage, each new interview, and each new claim in letters added another layer, and each layer forced the public to confront a more deliberate picture. It is easier to process a crime that feels sudden. It is harder to process a crime that appears planned. It is easier to blame an argument. It is harder to accept weeks of deception. It is easier to believe that a person snapped once. It is harder to believe that a person crossed a line, stepped back, and crossed it again. This is the lasting shadow of the Watts case. The murders happened in a single set of hours, but the case continues to unfold in the public mind because the evidence is recorded, the timeline is tight, and the contrast between the life that was displayed and the life that ended is almost impossible to reconcile. The home was ordinary. The street was ordinary. The family looked ordinary. The outcome was not. And for that reason, the story keeps resurfacing, not because the law failed to resolve it, but because the human mind keeps trying to locate the moment when a normal-looking life became a decision, and a decision became a tragedy that cannot be undone. By the time the sentence was read and the courtroom emptied, the case was already sealed in the legal sense, but it was not sealed in the public sense. The murders were committed in a single stretch of hours in August of 2018. Yet, the story kept expanding because the record kept releasing new ways to understand what happened and how it happened. The public did not only want an ending. The public wanted a path that led to the ending because a path feels like something you can recognize before it is too late. The official summary of motive, resentment, and infidelity is simple enough to fit in a headline, but those two words describe a dangerous combination. Resentment is not a single argument. It is the accumulation of conflict that is not resolved, the kind that turns ordinary problems into personal debts. Infidelity is not only the act of betrayal, it is the creation of a second life that competes with the first life, a second set of priorities that must remain hidden to survive. When resentment and infidelity exist together, the person living the double life can begin to see the family not as people, but as a barrier between what he has and what he wants. In the Watts case, that concept became part of the broader conversation because the evidence was not limited to forensic results and courtroom filings. The evidence included recorded moments of normal life, recorded moments of the investigation, and recorded moments of deception. The case unfolded on camera in a way that made viewers feel like they were watching the transition from worry to suspicion in real time. It began with a welfare check and a missing family. It ended with a confession and bodies recovered at an oil works site. In between, it produced a set of recordings that the public would watch and rewatch, searching for the point where truth slipped and performance took over. One reason the story stayed visible is that the early days contained a public plea that later became unbearable to revisit. Christopher Watts stood outside his home and asked for the return of his wife and daughters. Behind him, investigators were already using search dogs on the property. The scene captured a contradiction that people could not let go. A man could speak the language of hope, while the investigation moved through the house in the language of evidence. When the bodies were later recovered and the story was known,
That same plea changed meaning, not because it became new evidence, but because it became a record of deception in plain sight. When authorities released neighborhood surveillance footage in late November of 2018, that contradiction sharpened. The footage showed Watts in the early morning hours of August 13th, loading a gas can into his pickup truck and backing the vehicle into his garage. Investigators believed he was transporting the bodies to the remote work site where they were later discovered. The significance of that footage was not only what it showed, but what it denied. It denied the possibility that Shanann left the home that morning with the children. It denied the idea that the disappearance could be explained by a sudden trip or a spontaneous decision. It tied the case back to the driveway, to the garage, to the home that had already been searched while personal items remained inside. From there, the story moved into the media phase that often follows high-profile crimes, a phase where people try to convert horror into explanation. In December of 2018, Shanann's parents appeared on the ABC News series 2020 for the first interview they had given since the murders. That moment mattered because it shifted focus away from the perpetrator and toward the victims. It placed the case inside a family that had trusted the man who destroyed them. It reminded viewers that the story was not only about what a killer did, but about what the victims were: a mother, 2 children, and an unborn baby, and what the survivors lost. That same month, HLN aired a special report titled "Family Massacre: Chris Watts Exposed." The report revealed footage from police body cameras and security cameras in the police station interview room. Those recordings mattered because they showed the investigation as work, not as a montage. They showed how law enforcement moved through the Watts home during the welfare check. They showed the careful and repetitive approach investigators use when a story does not fit the fact. They showed how a person behaves when he believes he is still controlling the narrative, and how that control weakens when questions return again and again to the same missing hours. A recorded interview released by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation added another layer by bringing in the perspective of Watts' girlfriend. In that interview, she described behavioral changes in the days prior to the murders. Those details were not presented as a direct confession of planning, but as observations that fit the motive framework of infidelity and resentment. Behavioral changes before a homicide can be the visible edge of a hidden plan, or the signs of a person trying to maintain 2 incompatible lives at once. Either way, they became part of the public attempt to understand how the family home could still look normal while the internal reality was moving toward collapse. At the same time, the case was repeatedly connected in the media to family annihilation, sometimes called familicide. That label is important because it frames the crime as a pattern rather than an isolated event. Family annihilation cases are rare, and they are difficult for communities to process because they violate an assumption that many people rely on without thinking, which is that children are safest at home and that a spouse is the last person a family should fear. Former Federal Bureau of Investigation profiler Candice DeLong described these cases as rare in part because many perpetrators kill themselves after the murders. Watts later claimed he contemplated suicide out of guilt, but he did not die. He remained present long enough to perform innocence, to fail a polygraph, to confess, and to enter the court system. The media discussion expanded into talk shows because talk shows operate in the space between facts and meaning. In Die Schreemike Somik Prograd addressed the case on Dr. Phil alongside 4 analysts, Nancy Grace, Candice DeLong, Steve Cardian, and Susan Constantine. Their focus was motive, secret life, and profiling, which are the areas the public turns to when the legal case is already settled but the human question remains open. In January of 2019, the Dr. Oz Show provided commentary during an in-studio interview with the neighbor who helped build the case against Watts. That neighbor's role mattered because neighborhood surveillance and neighbor awareness helped narrow the timeline early, and because the story of a normal street becoming a crime scene is part of what made the case feel so close to ordinary life. Even after the sentencing, the case continued to shift because new claims from Watts emerged years later. In June of 2021, Inside Edition reported further confessions from Watts to a pen pal. In multiple letters, he explained that he had planned the murder for several weeks. He also wrote that the OxyContin found in Shanann's system had been given to her by him, and he described doing it in hopes of ending the pregnancy because he believed that would make it easier for him to be with his girlfriend. In those same letters, he revealed that he attempted to smother his children in their beds at home, but was unsuccessful. Those claims did not change the verdict because he had already pleaded guilty and was already serving life without parole. What they changed was the public understanding of intent. Planning for weeks suggests deliberation rather than a sudden moment of rage. Drugging suggests deception that begins before the final act, an attempt to manipulate outcomes quietly and to remove obstacles without confrontation. An attempted smothering that failed suggests that the crime did not exist as a single threshold crossed once, but as a sequence of thresholds crossed, paused, and crossed again. That picture is harder to accept because it is colder. It offers fewer comforting explanations and fewer excuses. This is where the Watts case becomes a story about narrative as much as violence. Watts's first confession attempted to assign the children's deaths to Shanann. That false claim tried to protect him from the full moral weight of what he did, and it tried to reshape public perception into something less absolute. Later, the record reflected that he also admitted to murdering the children. The legal file does not need a motive to convict a guilty plea, but the public mind always seeks motive, and shifting confessions create the sense that the truth is not only what happened, but also what the perpetrator was willing to admit at each stage. Meanwhile, adaptations began to appear, and adaptations changed the conflict from guilt to ownership. In December of 2019, Oxygen released a 1-hour documentary about the case as the first episode of a season of Criminal Confessions. In January of 2020, Lifetime released a film titled Chris Watts, Confessions of a Killer, as part of a series of films based on real cases. Shanann's family spoke out against the film, stating they had not been consulted and were not aware it was being made until it was already in production. They also said they were not making any money from it and feared it would increase harassment online that they were already receiving. That reaction exposes a painful truth about public cases. The court system finishes its work, but the story does not stop circulating. Footage is replayed, theories are posted, families are judged, survivors are blamed for things they could not control. In a case as high profile as this one, the victim's family can feel trapped inside the crime long after the perpetrator is locked away. Then, in late September of 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door. The documentary used archival footage including home videos, social media posts, text messages, and law enforcement recordings. That method placed viewers inside the illusion of normal life and then inside the break in that life, using the family's own recorded history to show how quickly a marriage can appear stable while it is disintegrating underneath. The documentary form mattered because it did not rely on reenactment to create realism. The realism was already there. It existed in recorded messages, recorded interviews, and recorded silence. This is why the Watts case remains so widely recognized. It is not only because of what happened, but because the proof of how it happened was captured and later released in pieces. The welfare check footage made the house feel familiar. The public plea made the driveway feel like a stage. The surveillance video made the garage feel like a boundary line. The interview room recordings made the investigation feel like a slow tightening. Each piece pulled the audience closer, not by adding new crimes, but by revealing how the truth was hidden during the hours when the public still believed the family might return. The most disturbing feature of the case is still the contrast. A 5-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood was the last known place where a pregnant woman and 2 young children were alive.
A remote oil work site became the place where their bodies were found. A man who had a job and a mortgage and a public image became a person charged with first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased human body. A plea deal removed the death penalty from sentencing at the request of Shanann's family, and that decision led to a final legal outcome in November of 2018. 5 life sentences with no possibility of parole, plus additional years.
Then, because of security concerns, he was moved out of state in early December and transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. Nothing about those facts explains why he did it, but together, they describe the arc of the case. It began with silence. It moved into public pleading. It collapsed into confession. It ended in life sentences.
Then it continued as a cultural phenomenon, fueled by footage, analysis, adaptations, and later claims that suggested planning and intent. If there is a reason the story continues to hold attention, it is because it forces a hard recognition about appearances. The home looked normal.
The family photos looked normal. The marriage, from the outside, looked like a typical American life under typical American stress. And yet, the outcome was the destruction of an entire family.
The motive, words, resentment, and infidelity are not dramatic by themselves. They are common human failures. What makes the Watts case horrifying is that those common failures were tied to uncommon violence, and that violence was carried out inside a life that still looked ordinary until the morning it vanished. After the plea and the sentence, the case stopped moving forward in court, but it did not stop moving through people's lives. The legal system had answered the only question it is designed to answer, which is who was responsible and what punishment would follow. Everything else remained.
The grief remained. The confusion remained. The need to make sense of it remained. One reason this case never truly went quiet is that the investigation happened quickly enough that the public watched it unfold almost in real time. A friend raised the alarm within hours. Police entered the home that same afternoon.
The missing person narrative lasted only a short time before it collapsed under pressure. That speed matters. In many cases, time blurs the early moments. In this case, the early moments were recorded, discussed, and remembered in detail. And the contrast between those early moments and the final outcome became part of the shock. The Watts home itself became a symbol. It was an ordinary suburban house that held ordinary objects: a purse with keys, medicine, a phone, car seats, a wedding ring. It held the signs of normal life that should have carried the family safely into the next day. Instead, those same objects became the quiet evidence that something was wrong from the first afternoon. The home looked familiar to the public because it was shown early and repeatedly. The driveway became familiar. The garage became familiar. The neighborhood became familiar. That familiarity is one reason viewers did not experience the case as a distant crime. It felt close because it looked like places they recognized. In the months and years after sentencing, the public kept circling one particular contradiction. Christopher Watts had presented himself as a worried husband. He had stood outside and asked for his family to come home. Search dogs could be heard on the property during his interview. That image stayed because it forced people to confront how deception can look like ordinary emotion. It did not require a disguise.
It required only a man speaking in public while the facts were hidden elsewhere. The neighbor security footage released on November 29th made that contradiction even harder to ignore. The video showed Watts in the early morning hours of August 13th loading a gas can into his pickup truck and backing the truck into the garage. Police believed he was transporting the bodies to the remote work site where the bodies were later recovered. The footage mattered because it tightened the timeline and supported the conclusion that Shanann never left the home with the children that morning, despite Watts' initial claim. It turned an ordinary motion into a record of the crime's practical reality, and it removed the last room for a harmless explanation. People also tried to explain the case by pointing to the pressures that were already visible in the background. The family had declared bankruptcy in 2015. Friends and news reports described financial strain and the stress of trying to maintain a stable life while debt and obligations remained in the background. Financial pressure does not cause murder, and it cannot serve as an excuse. But financial pressure can increase tension, and tension can become part of the environment where resentment grows. In this case, resentment is listed as part of the motive, and resentment often feeds on the feeling of being trapped, whether that feeling is real or self-created. The other part of the motive listed in the record is infidelity. Infidelity changes a person's incentives. It creates a second life that competes with the first. It pushes a person towards secrecy, because secrecy protects the new life from consequences. It can also push a person toward a fantasy of starting over. And in a fantasy, a family can start to look like a barrier rather than a responsibility. The fact that infidelity appears in the motive matters because it aligns with how many people interpret the case afterward as a crime shaped by a desire for a different life and a refusal to face the cost of ending a marriage in a lawful way. The media discussed the case in connection with family annihilation, also called familicide, which is the category that describes a person killing members of their own family. The record notes that many of these crimes occur in August before school starts, which may delay detection and investigation. That detail is unsettling because it shows how ordinary calendar moments can create opportunities for concealment. It also shows why the early report of Shanann's disappearance mattered. The alarm was raised before the day could fade into routine. The welfare check happened before excuses could solidify. The timeline stayed tight because the people close to her refused to accept silence as normal. A former Federal Bureau of Investigation profiler, Candace DeLong, is quoted in the record explaining that cases like this are rare because family annihilators usually commit suicide after the murders. Watts later claimed he contemplated suicide out of guilt. That claim does not change what he did, but it does provide a contrast that the public noticed. He did not disappear. He did not die. He stayed, he spoke, he performed normal behavior long enough to be questioned, and then he confessed after failing a polygraph. That sequence is part of why the story became so widely analyzed. People were not only processing violence, they were processing performance, the way a person can attempt to manage perception while the investigation is closing in. The record also includes an account presented on Dr. Phil by Watts' lawyer. In that account, Watts confessed to killing Shanann after an argument about divorce. During the murder, Bella walked in. Watts told her that Shanann was sick. He then loaded Shanann's body and the girls into his work truck without their car seats, and later smothered the girls one after the other. Whether people hear that account as a legal narrative or as a human narrative, the effect is the same. It describes a crime that unfolded in stages rather than a single instant. It suggests decisions repeated. It suggests time to stop that was not used. It suggests that the most horrifying acts did not happen as one uncontrolled moment, but as a sequence of choices. After the plea deal, the death penalty was not pursued at the request of Shanann's family, who did not wish for any further deaths. They supported the decision to accept the plea. This detail matters because it shows how families sometimes choose certainty over spectacle. A death penalty case can create years of litigation, appeals, and headlines. It can keep the perpetrator in the center of attention for a decade. A plea deal can end the case quickly and lock the outcome into place. In this case, the plea led to life without parole, with multiple life sentences and additional years for unlawful termination of the pregnancy and for tampering with a deceased body. The punishment was designed to be permanent. The family's choice was designed to end the public fight and begin the private grieving. Even after sentencing, the case still created operational problems for the prison system. Watts was moved out of state due to security concerns and transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security prison. That move is a reminder that a high-profile case does not end when a door closes. It continues as a safety issue. It continues as a management issue. It continues as a public obsession that can reach inside places that are built to isolate. As the years passed, the story remained active because it was retold using real material. There were body camera recordings from the welfare check. There were recorded interviews. There was neighborhood surveillance. There were public interviews given by Watts. There were also the visible traces of Shanann's life because she had shared parts of it online. That combination meant the case could be reconstructed with a level of detail that older cases often cannot provide. When Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door, the documentary used archival footage, including home videos, social media posts, text messages, and law enforcement recordings. The method did not simply tell the story. It replayed it through the family's own timeline, and that made the case feel immediate again, even for viewers who already knew the ending. Adaptations also created conflict. Oxygen released a documentary episode about the case. Lifetime released a film called Chris Watts' Confessions of a Killer. Shanann's family spoke out against the Lifetime film, stating they had not been consulted. They were not aware of the production until it was already underway. They were not making money from it, and they feared it would increase harassment they were already receiving. That reaction is part of the story because it shows the second harm that can follow a famous crime. The crime is one wound. The endless reproduction of the crime can become another. The case also continued to change tone because Watts continued to speak about it. In multiple letters reported years later, he described planning, drugging, and attempted violence that failed before the final murders. Those claims did not change the legal outcome, but they did change how people understood intent. A person who plans is different from a person who reacts in a single moment. A person who uses drugs to manipulate outcomes is different from a person who loses control without warning. A person who attempts a murder and fails and then continues toward the same outcome is different from a person who makes one terrible decision and cannot undo it. Each later statement pushed the story further away from a sudden eruption and closer to a deliberate path. That is why the case remains difficult to hold in the mind. It has an ordinary surface and an extraordinary ending. It has a suburban setting and an industrial disposal site. It has a public plea and a private truth. It has a quick investigation and a long cultural afterlife.
It has a legal conclusion and a human question that does not stop, which is how a family can look stable and still be living inside forces that are dangerous. There is no way to make the ending feel reasonable, because reasonable endings do not include the deaths of children and a pregnant mother. The most the public can do is study the sequence, not to justify it, but to recognize how quickly normal life can become abnormal when someone chooses secrecy, resentment, and escape over truth, responsibility, and separation. In the Watts case, the record gives the major points clearly. The motives listed as resentment and infidelity. The verdict was a guilty plea. The sentence was life without parole, structured to be permanent. The media accounts and adaptations kept the case visible. The later letters suggested planning. The family continued grieving while the world kept replaying the footage. And that is the final shape of the story's aftermath. One man is locked away. A family is gone. A house and a driveway that once meant ordinary life now means something else. And the case remains a warning about appearances, because the most frightening part is not that the crime happened in a strange place. It happened in a place that looked like home. In the months after the sentencing, one of the strangest parts of the Watts case was the way it stayed present, not through new trials or new hearings, but through the slow release of context. The legal system had already reached its conclusion. Christopher Watts pleaded guilty on November 6, 2018. He was sentenced on November 19th to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, with 3 life sentences served consecutively and 2 served concurrently, plus 84 additional years. He was moved to an out-of-state location on December 3rd because of security concerns, and he arrived at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wapun Wahiskara on December 5th. Those facts were stable and final, and they meant the story should have ended in the way most criminal stories end, with a closed case and a locked door. But this case did not behave like most stories, because it had been recorded from the beginning in ways that made it feel immediate even after it was over. It began with a friend driving to a house and realizing something was wrong. It moved into a welfare check that happened the same afternoon. It became national news while the investigation was still fresh, and it produced footage and interviews that later allowed the public to watch the collapse of a narrative step by step, without needing anyone to recreate it. The public fixation was not only about violence, it was about contrast. The setting was ordinary. The names were ordinary. The house was ordinary. The life described in the background sounded like a recognizable American routine. A marriage, 2 little kids, a pregnancy, a job, bills, and a suburban address. That is why the word familicide landed so hard when people encountered it. Because it describes the breaking of something most people assume is unbreakable. The idea that home is a protective space and that family is a shield rather than a threat. The record describes the motive in 2 words: resentment and infidelity. Those words matter because they are common enough to sound almost harmless when spoken in isolation. And yet, in this case, they appear alongside first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased human body. The words act like labels on a file, and the file contains a reality that goes far beyond the words. Even the physical details, as written in the record, became part of why the story stayed with people. Shanann was killed by strangulation. Bella and Celeste were killed by suffocation. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave near an oil storage facility. The children were placed into crude oil tanks, through openings that were only 8 inches in diameter. A medical examiner described scratches on Bella's body consistent with being pushed through that opening, and a tuft of hair found on the edge of a hatch. Those details are not included for shock.
They are included because they anchor the crime in physical reality and eliminate any possibility that the case could be softened into something ambiguous. The murders were not accidental. The disposal was not accidental. The choices were deliberate. In many cases, the public sees only the ending, the mugshot, the charges, the sentence, and then the story fades. In this case, the public saw the middle, the moment when it was still called a disappearance. They saw the driveway interview where he pleaded for his family to return. They heard search dogs on the property while he spoke. They watched the early statements before the confession. That is why the later release of the neighbor's surveillance footage on November 29th felt like a final nail. The footage showed him, hours after he killed his wife and daughters, loading a gas can into his pickup truck and backing the truck into his garage. Police believed he was transporting the bodies to the remote work site where they were later discovered. The record states that this footage, combined with the fact that Shanann had returned home in the early hours, proved she never left the home with their daughters that day, despite what Watts had claimed. For viewers, it was not only evidence. It was a visual representation of the lie that had been spoken in daylight. The case then became a kind of cultural artifact. In December of 2018, Shanann's parents appeared on the ABC News series 2020, their first interview since the murders. That moment mattered because it pulled attention back toward the victims and away from the man who killed them. It did not change the legal outcome, but it changed the emotional shape of the story for many people because it placed the loss in the voices of those who had to carry it. LB because that same month, HLN aired a special report titled Family Massacre, Chris Watts Exposed. The report revealed footage of Watts from police body cameras and from security cameras in the police station interview room. This matters because it changed the way the public understood the investigation. Instead of hearing about it in summary, audiences saw it. The welfare check, the movements through the house, the early questioning, the atmosphere of a case tightening. The recordings made the investigation feel like a slow closing door rather than a sudden reversal. Also, in December of 2018, the case entered the world of talk show analysis. On Dr. Phil, Phil McGraw spoke with analysts including Nancy Grace, former FBI profiler Candice DeLong, law enforcement consultant Steve Cardian, and body language expert Susan Constantine. They analyzed motivation, secret life, and profiling. That style of coverage appears when facts are already fixed, but the public still cannot accept them. People want to know how to recognize the threat before it happens. They want to know what signs were missed. They want to know whether the perpetrator looked different, spoke differently, behaved differently. Because if there are visible signs, then the world feels safer. In January of 2019, the Dr. Oz Show provided commentary during an in-studio interview with the neighbor who helped build the case against Watts. The neighbor's involvement mattered because the case included community visibility, a suburban street where cameras and neighbors became part of the timeline. The story did not unfold in isolation. It unfolded among people who could see the driveway, hear the doorbell, and check their recordings when police asked. The record also includes a version of events described in an interview on Dr. Phil by Watts' lawyer. In that account, the lawyer said Watts confessed to killing Shanann after an argument regarding divorce. During the murder, Bella walked in. Watts told her Shanann was sick. He loaded Shanann's body and the girls into the back seat of his work truck without their car seats, and later smothered the girls one after the other. That account reinforced a point that haunted many people who followed the case, which is that the crime was not only a single act. It was a sequence of acts carried out over time, with multiple moments where the outcome could have changed if the perpetrator had chosen to stop. As the case moved further into public culture, it also produced conflict about how stories are told And who has the right to tell them?
On December 7, 2019, Oxygen released a 1-hour documentary about the case as the first episode of the third series of Criminal Confessions. On January 26, 2020, Lifetime released a film titled Chris Watts, Confessions of a Killer as part of its Ripped from the Headlines series. The record states that Shanann's family spoke out against the film, saying they had not been consulted and were not aware it was being made until it was already in production.
They said they were not making any money from it and feared it would increase online harassment they were already receiving. This part matters because it shows how a crime can continue harming survivors long after the perpetrator is locked away. The legal system ends one chapter. Public attention can open endless chapters. Then, on September 30th, 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door. The documentary used archival footage including home videos, social media posts, text messages, and law enforcement recordings. That approach made the story feel like a timeline of real life rather than a retelling. It did not reconstruct the family's world with actors. It presented the family's own recorded presence. Then, the sudden silence. Then the investigation that moved through that silence.
For many viewers, the documentary did not create the case's notoriety, but it cemented it because it let people experience the progression from ordinary to catastrophic using the same materials investigators and family members had lived through. The continued attention also kept the case connected to broader discussions of familicide. The record notes that many crimes of family annihilation occur in August before school starts, which may delay detection and investigation.
In this case, detection was not delayed, and that is an essential point. The disappearance was reported the same day Shanann returned home. A friend acted quickly. A welfare check happened quickly. The timeline stayed tight. That tightness is part of why the investigation moved as fast as it did, and why the public watched the transformation from missing persons to homicide in such a compressed period of time. The record includes a quote from Candace Dane-LeLong, noting that cases like this are rare because family annihilators usually commit suicide after the murders, and it notes that Watts claimed he contemplated suicide out of guilt. That detail became part of public analysis because it again highlights contrast. He did not flee. He did not disappear. He did not die. He remained present and tried to hold the narrative together until the pressure of the investigation broke it apart. And then, years later, the case shifted again through a different kind of media. In June of 2021, Inside Edition reported further confessions from Watts to a pen pal. The record states that in multiple letters, he explained he planned the murder for several weeks, and that the OxyContin found in Shanann's system had been given to her by him, hoping to end her pregnancy because he believed that would make it easier for him to be with his girlfriend. The record also states he revealed he attempted to smother his children in their beds at home, but was unsuccessful. These claims did not change the sentence because the case was already resolved legally, but they changed how people framed intent. Planning suggests a colder, longer horizon. Drugging suggests manipulation before the violence. An unsuccessful attempt suggests repetition. And repetition suggests that the line between thought and action was crossed more than once. This is where the Watts case becomes more than a timeline. It becomes a study in narrative control. First, there was the public posture of ignorance and pleading. Then there was a confession that attempted to shift blame, with an initial claim that Shanann smothered the children before he killed her. Then there was the later admission that he murdered the children as well. Then years later, there were letters describing planning and additional details. Each stage shows the same pattern, a person admitting only what he has to admit at that moment, trying to manage how the story will be perceived. For the public, this makes the case feel like a story that keeps changing, even though the deaths are fixed and the legal outcome is fixed. For the victim's family, it means the story can keep reopening through content they do not control, through documentaries, films, and headlines that revive the details again and again. And for the community, it means a single address on a suburban street can become a permanent symbol, not only of violence, but of the distance between appearance and reality. The record gives the outline clearly. A family lived in a 5-bedroom home purchased in 2013. They declared bankruptcy in 2015. Shanann worked from home selling Thrive for a multi-level marketing company called Lavelle. Christopher worked for Anadarko Petroleum. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant and planned to name the baby Nico. She returned from a trip to Arizona at 1:48 in the morning on August 13th. She and her daughters were reported missing later that day after she missed an appointment and did not respond to messages. Police searched the home. The FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation joined the next day. Christopher claimed he did not know where his family was. He failed a polygraph on August 15th and confessed to killing Shanann. On August 16th, the bodies were recovered from a remote oil storage site. On November 6th, he pleaded guilty. On November 19th, he was sentenced to life without parole and later transferred out of state. That is the spine of the case, but the reason it stays in the public mind is the way the spine is surrounded by recorded life. The home videos, the text messages, the interviews, the body camera footage, and the surveillance footage create a sense that the audience can see the truth forming, even though the truth was hidden from them at the time. People return to the recordings because they want to believe the warning signs are visible. They want to believe the moment of deception is detectable. They want to believe a normal life contains a signal before it collapses. The Watts case does not offer that comfort. It offers an ordinary setting, an ordinary routine, and then a disappearance that lasted only a short time before it became a murder case with one of the most disturbing disposal scenes recorded in modern true crime. It offers a public plea that is now infamous not because it convinced anyone, but because it shows how normal language can be used to cover extraordinary violence. And it offers a cultural afterlife that continues to pull the story back into view, forcing new audiences to confront the same contradiction. A family can look like a finished story from the street. A marriage can look stable in photos. A man can sound convincing on camera, and then a friend knocks on a door, hears nothing, and the entire illusion collapses. By the time Christopher Watts was sitting in a prison cell, the case had already done something unusual. It had become a complete public record in the mind of the country, not just because of the brutality, but because so much of it was captured in real time. Many murder cases become famous later, after trials and documentaries. This one became famous while it was still being called a disappearance, while police were still walking through a house, while the public still believed the story might turn back toward relief. That is why the Watts case remains a reference point. It is not only the ending that people remember. It is the moment when the ending was not yet known, and the truth was still hidden behind ordinary language. When investigators entered the home on Saratoga Trail, they did not begin with certainty. They began with a welfare check, with a friend's concern, and with silence inside a house that should have contained normal movement. What they found was not a scene that screamed violence. It was a scene that whispered absence. A purse was still there. Keys were still there.
Medication was still there. A phone was still there. Car seats were still inside the vehicle.
A wedding ring was left behind. The family dog was unharmed in the home. None of those items proves murder by itself, but together they create a logic that is hard to escape.
A pregnant woman with 2 small children does not usually vanish without the things she needs to function. That is where this case shows its first lesson, which is how quickly a narrative collapses when routine is documented. Shanann missed an appointment and stopped responding.
A friend knew that was not normal and acted immediately. That action shortened the window in which a story could be built around delay. The difference between "we have not heard from her" and "we have not heard from her for days" is enormous.
In this case, there were no days to hide inside. There were only hours. The second lesson is how fast a timeline tightens when a neighborhood is wired with cameras. Investigators canvassed the area and learned that a neighbor had video that captured activity at the Watts home in the early morning hours. Later, authorities would release footage showing Watts moving around his truck, loading a gas can, and backing into the garage. Police believed this was part of transporting the bodies to the oil site where they were later found.
When people watched that footage, they often focused on expression and posture, on what he looked like, and whether he appeared nervous. The real power of the footage was simpler. It anchored time. It reduced the room for imagination. It narrowed the field of possible explanations because it reinforced that the day began with a controlled sequence of actions, not with a spontaneous family departure. The third lesson is how a public plea can become part of the permanent memory of a case. Watts stood outside his home and pleaded for his family to return, speaking to local television while the missing persons narrative still held. Search dogs could be heard on the property during that interview. That moment did not become famous because it solved anything. It became famous because it captured a contradiction that people could not reconcile after the truth was known. A man could speak in the language of fear and hope while knowing the outcome. A person could perform the role of a worried husband in daylight while the reality was buried elsewhere.
This is the point where investigators begin doing what they always do in high-risk missing person cases. They stop letting the story float in general statements and start forcing it to sit on specific facts. Where were you at this time? When did you last see them? What did you touch? What did you move?
What did you notice? The purpose is not to provoke emotion. The purpose is to locate the first moment where a narrative cannot hold.
On August 15th, the investigation reached that moment. Watts was administered a polygraph test, and he failed. A polygraph is not a verdict, but it is an instrument that changes the pressure in the room.
It is a demand for commitment. When a person cannot maintain their story under that demand, investigators often see what comes next. In this case, what came next was confession.
But even confession did not arrive cleanly. Watts confessed to killing Shanann and then falsely claimed he did so only after Shanann had smothered their daughters. He claimed he had discovered Bella already dead and that when he found Shanann in the process of strangling Celeste, he strangled Shanann in a fit of rage.
That version had a purpose. It attempted to assign the children's deaths to the victim, and it attempted to make the murder of Shanann sound reactive rather than initiated. This is another lesson of the case.
Confessions can be structured. They can be designed to reduce blame. They can contain true locations and false motives. They can be admissions wrapped in self-protection. Even in that self-serving version, Watts gave the investigators something concrete. He connected the disposal of the bodies to an Anadarko oil field where he worked. He marked locations on a photograph of the site. That single act transformed the investigation from a search across possibilities into a search across specific ground. The geography of the crime moved from the house to an industrial site, and with that move, the case changed forever.
On August 16th, investigators arrived at the oil field around 11 o'clock at night. They recovered Shanann from a shallow grave. They recovered Bella and Celeste from crude oil tanks.
Each child's body had been pushed through a hatch at the top of a different tank, with the opening described as 8 inches in diameter. The missing persons case ended there because the question of where they were had been answered in the worst possible way. The only remaining questions were how, why, and how the legal system would record and punish it. What followed was the legal phase, and in this case, it moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming and the defendant pleaded guilty. Watts was charged with multiple counts, including 5 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The structure of the charges matters because the legal system treats each death as its own crime, and it treats the unborn child as a separate legal harm through the pregnancy termination count. It also treats the disposal and concealment of bodies as a separate criminal act, because concealment is not the same thing as killing. The case also contains a detail that shaped its resolution. The death penalty was not pursued, and this decision was made at the request of Shanann's family, who did not wish for any further deaths. That choice is often misunderstood by the public, but in cases like this, it can be a deliberate pursuit of finality. A death penalty case can extend for years through litigation and appeals. A plea agreement can close the case faster and lock the outcome into place. In this case, the plea arrived on November 6, 2018. The sentence followed on November 19th. Watts received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 2 additional life sentences served concurrently and additional years on the other charges. In plain terms, the court ensured he would never be released. The punishment was designed to be permanent, and the structure was designed to reflect that this was not a single murder, but the destruction of an entire family, including an unborn child. Even after the sentence, the case continued to create security concerns. A high-profile prisoner can become a target, and the prison system has to manage that risk. Watts was moved out of state in early December and transferred to a maximum security facility in Wisconsin. That transfer is one more reminder that high-visibility crimes do not end when a door closes. They continue as safety issues, as management issues, and as stories that can still reach inside institutions that exist to isolate people from the public. The cultural afterlife of the case followed a predictable pattern, but with unusual intensity because of the amount of recorded material. Televised specials used body camera footage and interview room footage. Talk shows attempted to translate motive into something the public could understand. Documentaries used archival footage to recreate the feeling of time moving forward without revealing the ending immediately. Films dramatized the facts and sparked conflict about consent, profit, and the suffering of the victim's family. That conflict is part of the record, too. Shanann's family denounced the Lifetime film made about the case, stating they had not been consulted. They were not aware of the production until it was already underway. They were not making money from it, and they feared it would increase harassment online that they had already been receiving. This matters because it shows a second harm that can follow public crimes. The first harm is the murder itself. The second harm is the endless repetition of the story through content, which can keep victims' relatives trapped inside the crime long after the perpetrator is locked away. Then, in late September of 2020,
Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door. The documentary used archival footage, including home videos, social media posts, text messages, and law enforcement recordings. That approach did not simply retell the story. It replayed the family's own documented life, then replayed the sudden silence, then replayed the investigative steps that followed. It turned the case into a found footage timeline, which is one reason it reached audiences who had never watched the local news coverage in 2018. It made the story feel immediate again. All of this leads to the most disturbing reason the Watts case stays visible. It is not because the facts are complicated. The facts are clear. A pregnant woman was killed by strangulation. 2 small children were killed by suffocation. Their bodies were concealed at an oil site connected to the father's workplace. The killer pleaded guilty and received life without parole. The motive is listed as resentment and infidelity. Those are simple statements. The horror comes from how ordinary the surface was around those statements. The house was a normal home in a normal neighborhood. The family photos looked like any other family's photos. The language in the early interviews sounded like language anyone might use when they are scared and searching. And yet, the truth behind that language was annihilation. When people revisit this case, they often search for a single moment where everything changed. A single argument, a single decision, a single sign that would have warned someone in time. The record does not offer a neat warning sign. It offers a sequence. It offers a friend acting quickly. It offers police acting quickly. It offers a timeline tightening quickly. It offers a story collapsing under questioning. It offers a confession that arrived mixed with deception. It offers recoveries at a location that most people would never imagine. It offers a legal ending that was swift and permanent. And it offers a cultural afterlife that continues to replay the recorded pieces, because the recorded pieces make it feel as if the truth should have been visible from the start. The real lesson, and the reason it remains so difficult to accept, is that a person can live inside an ordinary-looking life and still carry out extraordinary violence. A person can build a public image and then use that image as cover. A person can say the words that sound right and still be lying. And a normal house on a normal street can become, in a matter of hours, the beginning of a story that ends in an oil field and a prison cell, with a family erased and a community left staring at the same quiet driveway, knowing that what happened there can never be undone. When people say that a case is closed, they usually mean the courtroom is quiet and the sentence is final. In the Watts case, the legal ending arrived quickly, but the story never felt finished because the record contains 2 things that keep pulling it back into view. It contains a tight, modern timeline, and it contains a public-facing performance that happened before the truth was known. The timeline begins with a small, ordinary moment that became a hinge for everything that followed. Shanann Watts returned home from Arizona in the early hours of Monday, August 13, 2018. She arrived shortly before 2 in the morning. It is the kind of time when a house is dark and a street is asleep. If nothing happened next, the day would have blended into the routine of school schedules, breakfast, work commutes, and a normal week. Instead, the routine broke almost immediately, and the break was noticed because Shanann had patterns that people around her recognized. She missed an appointment. She stopped responding. A friend felt the silence as wrong, not just inconvenient, and acted quickly. That speed matters. It is one of the quiet reasons the case moved as fast as it did. A missing family can disappear into delay if no one pushes early. In this case, the push happened the same day. The welfare check at the home on Saratoga Trail did not reveal blood on the walls or broken windows. It revealed something more unsettling, because it revealed absence without preparation. The objects that should have traveled with a pregnant mother remained in the house.
Her purse was there, her keys were there, her medication was there.
Her wedding ring was there. Her phone was later found inside the home. The family car was in the garage, and the children's car seats were still inside it. The family dog was unharmed. That is not the scene of a clean departure. It is the scene of a life interrupted. In the beginning, Christopher Watts said he did not know where his family was. He said he had last seen Shanann early that morning before leaving for work. He spoke to police. He spoke to cameras. He stood outside and asked for his wife and daughters to come home. For a short time, the public held two ideas at once. The first idea was hope. The simple belief that missing people can still be found alive. The second idea was suspicion. The instinct that something in the story did not fit the objects left behind. The case tightened the way many modern cases tighten. Through repetition and verification, investigators kept returning to the same missing hours. They kept comparing statements to what could be confirmed. They expanded resources quickly, and the involvement of federal and state investigators reflected the urgency and the seriousness of the situation. Then the story reached a turning point that cannot be softened. On August 15th, Watts was administered a polygraph and failed it. After that, he confessed. But even confession arrived in the shape of self-protection. He admitted to killing Shanann and falsely claimed he did so only after Shanann had smothered their daughters. He offered a sequence designed to shift the most unforgivable blame away from himself. Even in that false narrative, he gave the investigation what it needed next, a location. He connected the disposal of the bodies to an Anadarko oil field where he worked. He marked the locations on a photograph of the site.
The next night, investigators arrived at the oil field around 11 o'clock. They recovered Shanann from a shallow grave. They recovered Bella and Celeste from crude oil storage tanks.
Each child's body had been pushed through a hatch at the top of a different tank, and the opening was described as 8 inches in diameter. At that moment, the case stopped being a missing person story. The only remaining work was to document, charge, and prosecute.
The charges reflected the full scope of what happened. First-degree murder counts, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, tampering with a deceased human body. The motive in the record is summarized as resentment and infidelity, words that sound small compared to the outcome, but that describe the pressure points investigators and the public recognized in the background of the marriage. The legal ending came through a plea.
Watts pleaded guilty on November 6, 2018. The death penalty was not pursued, and that decision was made at the request of Shanann's family, who did not wish for any further deaths. On November 19th, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years, and additional life sentences served concurrently. In early December, he was moved out of state due to security concerns and transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. If the story ended there, it would still be infamous. But the Watts case did not end there, because it left behind something that true crime audiences rarely receive in such volume. It left behind recorded life. It left behind recorded investigation. And it left behind the public record of a man speaking as if he were searching, while the truth was already buried. This is why people return to the case. and why it can be told in a way that feels like it is unfolding in real time. The welfare check footage makes the home feel familiar. The neighbor surveillance footage anchors the morning. The interview room recordings show how pressure works, not as shouting, but as calm repetition that removes a suspect's ability to improvise. The public plea outside the house becomes unforgettable in hindsight, because it shows how ordinary language can be used to hold off the truth for just a little longer. When Colorado authorities released neighbor surveillance footage in late November, it added a new kind of permanence. The footage showed Watts loading a gas can into his pickup truck and backing into the garage in the early morning hours of the day of the murders. Police believed he was transporting the bodies to the work site. For the public, the footage did not introduce a new crime. It introduced a visible boundary line. It made the driveway part of the evidence. And it made the early claim that Shanann left with the girls even harder to imagine. As media coverage expanded, it did what media coverage often does. It searched for motive and pattern. It connected the case to family annihilation, a category that explains the shape of the crime without explaining the human decision behind it. It placed the story into expert panels, talk shows, and documentaries, each one attempting to translate an impossible act into a sequence that can be understood. But the most significant retelling for many viewers arrived years later through a format built almost entirely from what already existed. The documentary used archival footage, social media posts, text messages, law enforcement recordings, and home video footage to depict the events, and it played out like a found footage mystery. That method made the story feel closer than a traditional reenactment ever could, because it placed viewers inside the ordinary life that existed right up to the moment the family vanished. The case also revealed a second harm that can follow a famous crime, a harm that is not legal, but is still real. When a film dramatization was produced, Shanann's family spoke out against it, stating they had not been consulted and were not aware of the production until it was already underway. They said they were not making money from it, and they feared it would increase harassment they were already receiving. This is part of the Watts story because it shows how the victims' families can lose control of their own grief once a case becomes content. And then, as years passed, the record absorbed more claims from Watts himself through reported letters. Those claims described planning and intent in a way that made the case feel colder, and they shifted public interpretation further away from a sudden explosion and toward a deliberate path. The legal outcome did not change, but the way people understood the crime's intention kept changing as new statements entered the public conversation. At the center of all of it is a basic contradiction that does not soften with time. A family can look normal from the outside and still be at the edge of catastrophe. A suburban home can hold the evidence of disappearance while still looking like any other home on a quiet street. A person can speak in the language of love and fear while lying. And the shift from ordinary life to irreversible violence can happen inside a few hours, leaving behind objects that look like routine, and a silence that feels impossible to explain. The Watts case remains a reference point because it offers both clarity and discomfort. It offers clarity in the timeline and the legal outcome. It offers discomfort in what that clarity implies. It implies that the warning signs people want may not be obvious. It implies that motives can be common human failures, resentment and infidelity, while the acts are uncommon and extreme. It implies that the mask can hold until the moment it cannot, and that when it falls, what is underneath may be worse than anything the public imagined during the first day of hope. In the end, that facts do not change. A pregnant mother was killed.
2 children were killed. An unborn child was lost. The bodies were concealed at an oil work site connected to the father's employment. A guilty plea ended the legal process quickly. A life without parole sentence made the punishment permanent. What does change is how the story sits in the mind. At first, it sits as a missing persons case, a house that went quiet, a friend who acted fast, a family photo on the news. Then it sits as a confession and a recovery site, and a set of charges that describe not only murder, but concealment. Then it sits as a public record, replayed through footage, analyzed through motive, retold through documentaries and dramatizations, and carried forward by survivors who did not choose the spotlight but cannot escape it. And finally, it sits as a warning that does not feel satisfying, because satisfying warnings are specific and clear. The warning here is broad and unsettling. The warning is that normal can be a disguise. The warning is that a person can choose annihilation over separation. The warning is that the story can begin with a door that does not open, a phone that does not answer, and a friend who refuses to wait. That is the final shape of this case. A short timeline, a permanent sentence, a long afterlife, and a silence at the center that will never be filled. Because the people who should have grown older, the people who should have walked out that front door and continued their lives, are gone.